Hey everybody, welcome to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. I am Michael Thiessen, and I'm a full-time Vue educator, creating content and courses and books and all that great stuff to teach you about Vue and Nuxt. And I'm here with Alex, my wonderful co-host.
Thank you so much. I'm Alexander Lichter. I am a Nuxt team member, a web engineering consultant by day, and also creating content around Vue and Nuxt on YouTube, streaming every now and then, as Michael is also doing, by the way. Definitely check it out. And today we want to talk about one of the characteristics of Vue, very typical, even though they're frameworks that are named similarly and not that much like the word, reactivity in Vue.
Yes.
So it's a lovely topic. I think reactivity, when I started with Vue, was one of the things back in the Vue 2 times that really started clicking with me, where I don't have to think about, when does the component re-render and how to, I don't know. There was not that much mental overhead. It just worked magically.
Yeah, and just the right level of magic. I think there's always this tension between how much magic and, background things are going on in a framework. And sometimes if you have too much, it can be confusing because you're like, wait, how does this even work? I don't understand what's going on. But the way that Vue's reactivity system works, it sort of just feels like this is how programming should work. Like, I feel like even beginner programmers don't often realize that programming isn't reactive by default,
That's true. Maybe that's a good point to start on, like not even focusing on Vue, but taking a step back and talking about what reactivity is and how it works in, let's say, quote unquote, JavaScript.
Yeah. So reactivity, it's actually more common than you might think. If you think about spreadsheets like Excel or Google Sheet or whatever, they're reactive because when you update one cell, it will trigger updates in all the other cells that use it. And so it's a familiar idea and it's a familiar concept. And when it comes to programming, we are basically trying to figure out when this variable updates or this object updates, we want to execute another function. That's like at its most simplistic way description. That's how I would describe it. When this value updates, execute this function. And we call these functions that get executed, they're typically called effects because they're sort of like a side effect. As you're going in the code, they're sort of off somewhere else being run and executed, and you don't have to worry about them. They're just sort of happening. And so that's what any good reactivity system or any reactivity system at all, it keeps track of that for you. It puts together, okay, when this value updates, I got to run this thing and I got to rerun that thing. And it's going to try and collect it all in a way that makes sense and optimizes it so we're not rerunning things extra and all of that. But that's at its core, that's what reactivity is.
That totally makes sense. And I wonder, like, I don't know, if we have like JavaScript now and we define a variable, be it let or const, whatever people choose right now, and the current Twitter drama is about. And like, how can we make it reactive in a way? Because I think lots of people struggle with that in JavaScript. Like, okay, how do we add reactivity there?
Well, I think we're going to touch on this a little bit later, but the easy answer is to use the standalone package that Vue has.
And fair. Because there is no way in plain JavaScript JavaScript doesn't offer reactivity out of the box like part of its paradigms in the language.
No, it does not. So you have to build that yourself, and we've already got it in Vue, so just stick with that. That's what I would say.
That totally makes sense. And I think very often, like people, I don't know, once again, like vanilla JavaScript, it's a great example. If you've ever built, I mean, you did, but probably some of our listeners didn't, or maybe they did, like a to-do list in plain JavaScript or any other like tiny thing with DOM updates here and changing things. Sometimes you would probably just wish, if that variable updates, can you just update that part of the HTML? Like what we have in Vue with everything from like class bindings, computer properties, the whole template. And it doesn't work. You have to do it manually. And you have, like, maybe you have listeners on a certain event, like click and do something on that. or with variables, you have to somehow change them, do all the manual labor, and that's very unfortunate because the code itself, it doesn't really look pretty. It looks very imperative. It's basically computer do this exactly what I tell you, not what the logic behind it is, like the idea behind it. It's really the low level operations, and that's very often lots of boilerplate and overhead, not nice to read and not very declarative and descriptive.
Yeah. So for those of you listening or watching who started with Vue maybe, or didn't have the opportunity to enjoy jQuery or writing these web apps like this, basically, like, so if you have a to-do list and you want to, so in Vue, if you select something, you would have a selected class that you might want to put on there to change the styling to show, okay, yeah, you selected this in the UI. And in Vue, that's pretty obvious or pretty easy. We can just have a variable, we put it into the template, and then whenever that selected ref, or however you're defining that, if that becomes true, then it's going to apply that class, and then the styling updates, and it's straightforward and it's simple. But before reactivity and all of this, we would have to bind to that button or the checkbox or however you're doing your selection, and then you say, okay, you got to handle that click. When that click happens, then you got to update the list of selected items. Okay, now you've got a new list of selected items. You have to go through every single one of these items, and you either have to remove the selected class from the DOM elements that are no longer selected, and then add back in that selected class to the ones that are now selected. So you have to do this all manually yourself. You have to traverse the DOM and go through each element and update things. And if the text changes, you have to do the same kind of thing. You have to find the element that changed and redo the text. And it's just like a headache because there's so many opportunities for errors and bugs, and it's just really tedious.
Exactly.
Even describing that was tedious to me.
Yeah, that's also what I just realized. Like, even the description of it sounds like a giant pain. But yeah, luckily we don't have to do that anymore, because when we use a modern framework, almost all of them come with reactivity built in a way, or maybe using another framework's reactivity. So also we'll touch on later on that. But when we take a look at Vue exactly, we could look a little bit back to the good old times of Vue 1. That was probably before both of our times. I mean, at least I started with Vue 2. You also started with Vue 2, right?
Yeah, I started with Vue 2.
Yeah. So we both didn't use Vue 1, but recently we talked with Avenue. Yeah, you might know that guy. Maybe you heard the episode already in episode 15. And he mentioned a little bit about Vue 1 and its reactivity there. So the idea there was like Vue 1 had no compiler, right? So there was some kind of reactivity system, but the idea was that the framework, so Vue, was going through the whole DOM to like scan for things, like walk the DOM, and then execute the reactive changes. So there was not too much magic behind it, like we'll see in the next major versions of Vue. And actually, there's still a very similar implementation available nowadays, which is in Petite Vue. So in that tiny made for progressive enhancement package, that's basically a very tiny version of Vue, hence the French name Petite Vue, that you can use. And that's based on Vue's reactivity system. But how to actually apply the change is the same idea. It will just walk through the DOM. But what won't work with this is things like server-side rendering. And performance-wise, if you have lots of items, it's also not super practical. But luckily, that changed in Vue 2, right?
Yeah. So like the Vue 1 implementation basically just takes away that tedious aspect from you without any extra modifications. But Vue 2, we have a more mature, optimized version. The compiler was introduced so we can have this virtual DOM. So what Vue 2 does is, instead of going through the entire DOM, all of the elements that are rendered to the page, it has this virtual representation of what's actually being rendered. And when it needs to do an update, it updates the virtual version and then compares the old version with the new one, so it knows exactly what has changed, and so it can just target those specific spots without having to go through the whole thing, and it can just zero in on those exact places that need to be updated.
Exactly. And especially if you use single file components. So if you like build your whole front end in Vue, have a build step, then of course the compiler can optimize things where it knows like, okay, this will never change. Even with like a runtime template, you can say, okay, here is like the double curly brackets. Here is like an insertion or like a string interpolation, and this part is just plain HTML that will never change. So that's a really good way that Vue to with its virtual DOM improve things, especially when the virtual DOM was introduced back in time, the browser DOM was not really that fast. That's also why other frameworks relied on virtual DOM, because it was simply easier to do the calculations on your own than just letting the browser check all the things, because it was simply not optimized for that.
Another change not a change between Vue 1 and Vue 2, but between 2 and 3 was how the actual reactivity system itself was done. So the original implementation of Vue's reactivity system relied on this object.define property. And that method basically lets you set or modify an existing property on an object. And so essentially what was going on is when you put things in that data block in your component, if you're using the options API, which is what we had back in Vue 2, then it would take that data object, and for every single property that you've got defined on there, it would basically redefine that and wrap it in a custom getter and a custom setter. And using that could track the dependencies and know, okay, this value depends on this, and it could figure that all out. But there were a few issues with that implementation.
Yeah, there were quite some caveats, especially if you, let's say you have just a new view for everybody still knowing Vue 2, you had like this new view, and then you could pass in like whatever the component definition might be, like the parts, the options of that instance. And they could say, okay, let's just pass in for data an object, and you can just set like, I don't know, name, and set it to a name. And now that object, and with that key value pair name and a string, that's reactive. But if you would then, and you can do it in JavaScript, right, just like add another key value pair to that, like age, for example, that isn't reactive then anymore. So all the keys, even if you might not use them straight away, and the values, they have to be present in the beginning. And also same idea for arrays. Like there were a few caveats that really made you program in a certain way to not run into them. I also would say it's in a way a good idea to ensure that all the keys are present, especially in times of TypeScript as well. But back in Vue 2, TypeScript support was, well, we had class components and the rest was trickier, let's say. So most of the times the caveats weren't that tricky if you had like a nice and clean way of programming. But we all know that we don't always go for the cleanest and best way. And sometimes even, I remember I was wondering like, okay, is this my logic that's buggy? Is that because I run into a reactivity issue? Because like sometimes you had the ESLint rules to check them, but not all of them were easily to discover. So every now and then it was also a little bit of a headache if you don't choose like an elegant way to program.
Yeah, and I wrote a really long article on debugging reactivity, and most of it is from Vue 2 because of these inherent issues. And Vue 3, there's not really a lot of reactivity like funniness that you can get into. And I remember many times I've even set like in that data portion, just setting a value to undefined, because if it existed when the component was created, then it would be made reactive.
Then it's safe. Yeah.
And then it's safe, and you're like, okay, good. And then you can keep going. Or other like with arrays, you have to like, you can't just push things into an array because this getter and setter wouldn't detect it in the same kind of way. You'd have to like add these extra methods to like,
Or didn't push work? And like if you like access an index directly, it didn't work. Like adding, I don't know, like array 100 or something when you have like a gap in between. There were some weird caveats for sure.
There was something, or like setting. Oftentimes when you're working with arrays, you might want to like set it to an empty array, and then all of a sudden, you lose reactivity.
Exactly.
Yeah. It was a confusing time, and I think I've forgotten a lot of like the caveats because
which is good.
I don't need to remember them, which is
Exactly. Also,
fantastic.
the link to the article from Michael, of course, it's in the show notes or in the description if you watch that on YouTube. So don't forget to check that out if you're still using Vue, or you're like, hey, wait, caveats, never heard of that. Let's check how it was back in the good old times, and how it's now in the better times. Well, luckily, Vue 3's reactivity, it's not based on that, let's say, hacky workaround that Evan came up with, like hacking around with object-defined property and like using getters and setters, because we don't have a this anymore and like the composition API. Well, we can still use the options API in Vue 3, but now the whole system is based on proxies. So how does that exactly work?
Proxies are an interesting JavaScript feature which let you do some fun stuff. So basically a proxy is like, you can think of it as like this special object in a way. And with this proxy, you can take an existing object and wrap this proxy around it. And this proxy will let you intercept any time that you want to access a property or set a new property on this object. It also lets you do some other things which are probably less useful. But basically, anytime you go object dot and then access some property, that proxy will be triggered first. So instead of in Vue 2, where we had this defined property that was wrapping with a custom getter and setter, we can actually do this dynamically on the fly. So when you add when you're going to set a new property on an object, it will trigger the set function in this proxy. And so then we don't have all these caveats because it'll do it on the fly. And even as you access like nested properties and things like that, it will track that reactivity down because we've accessed it on the root object there.
Yeah, that's really sweet. Like I remember when I teach about proxies, usually in one of my JavaScript workshops, then I do like, hey, implement the dot notation. So you could have like a very nested object, and you could do like a.b.c and get the value from like exactly that. That's always a fun case, so you can see what power proxies and like the whole meta programming really has.
I think one time to try and understand proxies better, I implemented an immutable library. So like it would
Cool.
you would use a proxy to wrap an object, and it would make that entire object immutable. So you couldn't change the values. But the really like inefficient way of doing this would be to do it for an entire nested object and like recursively go down through the entire object. But you actually don't need to do that with proxies because you've got this get that you can intercept, and you can just say, well, if you get a nested value, well then when I return that to you, I'm just going to dynamically wrap that in a proxy and make that immutable. So it like, as you access things, it makes them immutable. And when you try and set it, it will just return a new immutable object. And so you can like, you can do all sorts of fun, interesting things like that.
That's pretty cool. And on that note, also, I want to highlight this talk, also link for that in the description / show notes, which is from Mark Bacchus, was also on the show a few episodes ago, and he built a time machine with proxies. So that's also fun to visualize that. Definitely check that out. And yeah, with proxies, all the caveats of Vue 2 reactivity are gone. There's only one new caveat that came with that, which means no support for IE 11. Shocking. I mean, luckily, most of us don't need to support IE 11 anymore. All of those out there, if you still need to, first leave a comment, and second, our condolences, thoughts and prayers, because that's tough. That's tough. All the cool features you sadly have to miss out. But I think also on that note, the ecosystem really changed with so many frameworks deciding to drop IE 11, not supporting it anymore. For example, Vue wanted to bring like a legacy build that still supports it, but it sounds just like, no, let's just not do that anymore because it's not worth the effort.
Yeah, I remember being lucky enough that I think well before most things were dropping support for IE, then I was, the place that I worked at was like, you know what, we're just not going to worry about it. So sorry everyone who's using that.
And yeah, I mean, I think now it's like below 0.1% or something. I mean, like can I use will tell you when you listen to the episode. Also, link for that in the notes if you really want to know
Yeah.
how many people still use it. But it's usually not significant except you work for like, oh yeah, certified government systems that only have these and these browsers and are hard to update, which is a super edge case. It might be the case, but yeah, then it's tough.
So the next thing we want to talk about before we keep going here is ref and reactive and how they work in Vue 3. So basically, these are the ways that we in the composition API define reactive values. And there's some confusion between, oh, should I use ref? Should I use reactive? And actually, like if you look at the implementation in Vue's source code, they actually are using the same code, really. So if you pass an object to ref, it's the same as passing an object to reactive. I forget which way it works if ref calls reactive.
Yeah,
or
ref
if
calls reactive under the hood.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you pass an object to ref, then it's actually just going to call reactive. So don't worry about that too much. The main differences there are whether you're able to just access the property straight up or if you have to do the dot value syntax. That's really the main gist of it. I wrote a very long, in-depth article on this if you want to like dive into that.
I mean, the shorthand also is reactive doesn't work for all data types, right? If you just have a string, you can't just do like reactive and then
Right.
Michael, for example. You have to have an object that holds something. And if you now think you have reactive, then you have an object in there and you say, what could the key name be? Value, maybe. And then you say, okay, the value is the string Michael. It kind of looks like ref already. So you can somehow reproduce the structure there too. But I think most people in the community, and I think that's also what was mentioned in your article, they prefer ref over reactive.
Mm-hmm.
I've even seen some people voicing opinions saying like, oh yeah, maybe we should deprecate reactive. And I don't think that's a necessary debate to go because it's still super helpful if you have things you want to group together, like form states, for example, or if you just want to say, hey, I want to reproduce what Vue 2 or like the options API in Vue 2 did with data. Or the good old Vue 2 observable, which we didn't even mention, which it's basically like data, but standalone. So it still serves a purpose. But I personally also am a big fan of deciding whether I want to use the reactive reference. So like, okay, here is something holding a reactive value, let's say a string, or I pass the value directly. So I am in control whether I say, okay, do I want to work with the proxy that will track reactivity and continue changing when something changes? Or do I just want to say, okay, I take the string from here on and I'm good? While in reactive, you really can't do that because you don't see if a value is reactive. If you define it by reactive, you don't have like a dot value or something. It doesn't give you extra type. It's like really under the hood and subtle. And I like this expressiveness in the code there.
And one interesting thing about reactive, which I think not a lot of people maybe understand, and I think I learned this from Eduardo, who I forget exactly where, but he was wrapping a set or a map object in reactive, and then that it just, because of the proxies, it just works. And like you can have these reactive objects. They don't have to be just like plain old JavaScript objects. You can wrap other things in them. And I haven't tested this, but I would expect that like if you have other like non-reactive libraries that you're using and you need to get them to be reactive, you might get pretty far by just, chucking it inside of a reactive and seeing how that goes. Although there might be some edge cases that you might want to watch out for.
There might be, yeah. Same with like classes. Like it works with the Reactivity API, but there are some caveats. So also there, use them with caution. But that's true. That's the beauty of Reactive, that you can pass in maps and sets, and it will just work, which is pretty lovely. So also there is no necessarily black and white. I still think it's a good recommendation to say use ref unless you have a good reason not to. Like, oh yeah, I want to group form state together, and I want to deal with a map or a set, for example. So that's all totally valid. But I think also as I said, the expressiveness and being able to say, okay, this is definitely reactive versus it's not anymore, compared to, oh yeah, we don't really know because TypeScript can't tell
Yeah.
and our code might not. That's a big benefit and big plus for ref in this case.
Yeah. And with ref, we also get a shallow version, which can be really useful for performance optimization. And in Nuxt has been making changes how the data fetching works to shift to using the shallowRef by default. Yeah, so can you explain how that works?
Absolutely. I already did in one of my videos, which is also linked below as usual, but a very quick summary. The idea is right now ref is deeply nested reactive. So if I have like a big object, let's say, I don't know, a kilobyte of JSON, and then represented it in JavaScript object, and then if something changes there, maybe if you refetch data, that's a perfect example, then, well, Vue has to go through everything and check if something deep down changed or not. And very often there are cases like data fetching where you don't want that deeply nested reactivity because, okay, if I fetch data, fine, I get the new response. I can just replace the whole content of that ref. And then if I fetch it again, same idea, just replace it. I rarely have to edit things like in place. Sometimes I do maybe a computer property based on a ref and then say, okay, this is like, I don't know, the user's pet name or whatever. And I don't change things in there straight away. So whenever you have that case, another scenario is, for example, integrating third-party state libraries like immutability and things. Then, okay, there's a new state. I don't want to edit it in place. I just want to take the new value and use it. shallowRef is the way to go. And there's also shallow reactive for that, by the way. So we have the equivalents for both. And yeah, commonly it's a really good scenario for performance optimization when you have big data structures. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't bother to change things around. So it's really more like it's a low cost change. Just have to keep in mind that you cannot, like that the ref doesn't automatically, sorry, the shallow ref doesn't automatically update when you change things, only when you replace the whole thing. There's one thing though, there is another function called triggerRef, which will basically trigger an update for ref, which you can also use with a shallowRef to say like, okay, maybe I edited something here and I just want to trigger an update because, I don't know, your state library does something weird or you have a certain case where you want to do that. That's totally fine. Then you can combine these two as well.
Right, so you can have that full control over it so that it won't update unless you have like a very specific situation. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I would agree with you on the not using it by default. I don't know if I've ever used it because I haven't run into a performance issue where I needed to prevent some rendering or whatever updates. And so yeah, thinking about it, I would worry that if you just use shallowRef by default everywhere, then you might get confused because you're trying to update something and it's not working and you're like, wait, what's going on? And it's probably just better to use ref by default.
Yeah, I would say so too, even though some people argue that like, oh yeah, why don't you use shallowRef by default and only ref if you need like nested reactivity? Especially the people coming from other frameworks where it's not that common to have that deeply nested, like tracking-based reactivity out of the box. They feel like, okay, this is super strange to me. Like, why is it not that way around? And in the end, I think it's about teaching it. And I mean, ref has been the main API for a while. And having that convenience out of the box and switching to the more performance-oriented solution is, in my opinion, a better way than saying, oh, we want to optimize everything by default and then maybe lose on DX, because maybe then people are not aware of ref, but it would be of shallow ref, or maybe it would be named differently. I don't know, deep ref, and people are like, what's a deep ref? So in that case, I really think it was a good idea to choose ref and reactive and not the shallow versions, like the not deeply reactive ones by default, which also aligns with what the composition API gave us, also deeply nested reactivity.
I have this sort of rule rule of thumb where sometimes you see something like this where it's like, oh, shallowRef is more performant. And so then the next thought is, well, if it's more performant, why isn't it the default all the time? Mm-hmm. And if it's not the default, then there's usually a good reason why it's not the default. And there's trade-offs there. that the people implementing it have thought through. And maybe it could be as simple as it would be a breaking change. That could be one good reason, but there are often trade-offs. And if you think about it a little bit more and like dig in a little deeper, then you realize, oh, okay, it actually makes more sense that the more performant version is not the default. And like, because otherwise they would just make it the default. Like, why would you make it slower by default?
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, also in that way, like probably writing assembler is faster than writing, I don't know, C++, and still most people write C++ or like Rust or whatever. So it's like also like an abstraction thing and a convenience.
Sure.
So
yeah,
we have all this abstraction on top for exactly that reason too. And the good part is, I mean, if we take just JavaScript, we also say like we don't write like a for loop with like an actual like for that I equals 0 and so on. We rarely do that nowadays because it might be more performant than like a for each or like a for off loop. Not sure in the latter one though, but for each definitely is a bit less performant. But does it matter? Very often not. And if it does, then why not refactoring the code saying, hey, okay, this needs to be fast. This needs to process like millions or billions of records. And this hot part is optimized to the fullest extent. There you go.
So I did mention it earlier, but I want to make sure that we point out that Vue's reactivity system is available as a standalone package. So Alpine.js uses this internally to have reactivity, and you can implement or you can use it yourself on whatever kind of project you want. If you want to make your own front-end library and you want to get that reactivity, and you can just, put it in, and there are no external dependencies. It works great. And
it's tested. Very important.
It's very well tested and, used all over the place because this is what Vue uses internally. And yeah, it's a great way. I'm glad that Vue 3 switched to this very modular package-based system with like all the different pieces separated out so that we get this reactivity system separated out. So if you want to write some Node application that has reactivity in there, or I have no idea.
You can even use it in the backend. Yeah, that's true. Or you can even use it in your current, I don't know, jQuery. I mean, they can also just like use Vue or Vue directly. Yeah. Or let's think about, I don't know, you have a React app that you want to convert to Vue at some point. You can start with reactivity, or even saying like, no, I don't want to convert, but I really enjoy that reactivity pattern. So why not using it? It works. It's totally fine. And yeah, Michael, as you mentioned, there are also other like tiny like front end like libraries using it. Vue also earlier, one of them. And besides Alpine, also Arrow.js from Justin Schrader from Good Authors also using Vue's reactivity under the hood. So yep, definitely play around with it. You get like the computed, the watch, the ref and reactive, and the shallow versions, and a couple more things like a few utilities here and there. And it's worth it if you just say like, I don't need a full-blown framework, or I just want to build a tiny thing of my own. And Vue's reactivity system, I think, is super accessible to people because you don't have to learn about all like, I don't know, all these fancy things. You basically go with like, okay, this is a ref or reactive. You have these two choices. You can just use ref and it's fine. And then you can like have a computer property based on that. You can watch things. You can and then do even more advanced things. But in the end, it's also interesting that this is, well, one of the first modern frameworks that has like a signal-based approach with this composition API. But yeah, we make a separate episodes on signals and why there is no, let's say, quote unquote, signals in Vue directly. Just wanted to mention it there. So if you haven't heard about signals yet, you probably can just look it up. Also, take a look at the current proposal and check out the episode when it's coming out.
Yeah, so the last topic we've got for today is vapor mode, coming in the future, near future, perhaps, to Vue, a more performant way of compiling and rendering your apps, your components. And it comes with some changes to how reactivity works.
Exactly. So then we take a look at the template part. Like before, we talked about the script part a bit. We talked about the template part with the virtual DOM, which is not that relevant for the script part. I mean, they work together in the end. But yeah, vapor mode, the script part stays as it is, as long as it's composition API with the script setup part, because otherwise Vapor Mode is not working. It only supports that at the beginning. Maybe we'll support Options API at some point, but that's not on the list right now, because as Michael, as you said, it's work in progress. There are some really nice commits, and there's some really good efforts there in the repository. You can try it out already, and the whole idea is that okay, Vue has a virtual DOM, and as mentioned before, that worked pretty well when the browser DOM was pretty, let's say, slow. And then frameworks came around saying, okay, we don't need a virtual DOM. Svelte came around and said, hey, I just compiled myself away. I'm just gone. It was faster. And then on top of that, Solid came around, and Ryan Carniato, who is amazing in terms of performance, found out that there's a pretty amazing way using signals to basically also declare effects for each part of your component, of your template, and make it extremely fast. So also there, the idea of Vapor Mode is to have like a solid-like architecture. It's not one by one the same thing, but also using the power of signals and these tiny effects, so reactivity everywhere, to make sure that the DOM is updated even faster. And even though very often the bottleneck is rarely the framework, as in, oh yeah, if you render these 10 items, then probably the API call will take longer than the framework renderer. But what if you have like a big data grid or like data visualization, also very important, where it's really necessary to like transform these SVG elements or create all these new tiny nodes, then there's a big difference for sure. So Vapor Mode, which we'll definitely also talk separate when it comes closer and closer to the release. Once again, you can try it out already and it's working pretty well. That will be another thing for DejaVue. Did you already try it out, Michael? Did you already have a look at the REPL?
I have not tried it out, but there's the playground where you can see, you can write some Vue code and then see what it gets compiled to in Vapor Mode. And it's really interesting to try to see and understand how it actually works.
That's definitely the case. And I'm very happy to see that Vapor Mode is coming as a response to, okay, it's opt-in, you don't have to use it for your whole application. You can if you want to. You can use it for components that need that benefit, which is also great. Like you can decide, oh, this component, I render it 2,000 times. Perfect. This should be a component we use with Vapor Mode, and maybe the component's rendering a component, but the rest of the app can stay as is, which also makes possible migration easier. Think about, you have Options API everywhere. Vapor Mode only composition API or script setup. So then you just have to convert 2 components and stay, the rest can stay as it is. So I really like that progressive approach there. That's once again a core identity of the Vue framework. And also like to see that, well, even after more than 10 years, there's still innovation and there's still modernness coming in.
Yeah, and to tie it back into the reactivity talk that we were having before. So if we go back to that to-do list, where before Vue and reactivity, we were needing to like manually update everything in the DOM ourselves. Well, imagine that we don't get the template stuff from Vue, but we get this standalone reactivity package that Vue has. Now, if we took all of the variables that can update and we actually wrap them in a watch or a watch effect, and inside of that, we write our vanilla JS that goes into the DOM and updates the classes as necessary, or updates the text for the different nodes. That's essentially how Vapor Mode is working. I think that's maybe a good way of thinking about it. It's got like each little update to the DOM is wrapped in this effect so that it knows, okay, when this variable updates, I need to update the class name here. When this variable updates, I need to go and change the text on this DOM element here. And so instead of doing it all as one big thing with the template and the vnode, the virtual DOM and all that kind of stuff, it's, as Alex was mentioning, it's like this fine-grained, very tiny little reactive updates kind of sprinkled all over the place.
Exactly. And that allows like even further optimizations, because then you know exactly what will be updated and what won't, because it's not very common that like your whole component, like straight away, every tiny piece changes. It's more like, okay, maybe one part of it will change. The rest will stay the same. So then you don't have to go through the VDOM and check what will stay and what will not stay. You just have to execute the functions, the effects, so to say,
Yeah.
that will change. And of course, then we also have to add the compiler into that. So the compiler can optimize a lot of things, which is, I think, what the Vapor team is on right now. Also, what Evan said a couple episodes before. That's then as soon as the feature parity with the basics are there, then it's performance time. And I'm really curious to see the benchmarks on that, because also there, I think with the Vue compiler and its power, Vapor mode and the fine-grained reactivity, we will see a big jump there. And again, in certain parts, it will make no difference for application, and in certain part, it might be a huge one. I'm especially curious how it will be with server-side rendering, how that will change there. If that will be like a bigger overhead, it will be faster. Probably the second, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. And I think that's the end of our episode here on reactivity. If you have any questions about reactivity or want to know more, please drop a comment on YouTube or wherever you're at on Twitter. We're watching and reading those comments. And so your feedback is greatly valued.
Absolutely. And yeah, let us know if you like something, especially about Vue's reactivity system, or if like, oh, there's this one thing, I wish it would be different. Please let us know. Maybe one day it will be changed, or at least we can cover it and say why it is so horrible. I'm kidding. But still, let us know. We're really interested in all of that. Of course, check out the episodes before, because I mean, we had 2 amazing episodes with Evan Yu. We had amazing other guests as well. So please listen to all of them, all of these episodes. Check out Michael's YouTube, Michael's website, and take a look. Maybe it's a stream or a video in the description. And with that, I hope you see you for the next episode or some before. I wish you a great day.
We'll see you in the next one.